I'm Sarah Wilson, and you're listening to the Roots and All podcast. Hello, and welcome to this week's podcast. Today, I'm going to launch a new segment called Getting to the Roots of, and this is where we go back to basics on some gardening topics that it's maybe assumed that you already know. When you pick up a seed catalogue or go into your local garden centre or shop online for plants, it's kind of expected that you'll know about plant life cycles. But I know when I started out creating my first garden, it was one of the things that baffled me, and I see some of my clients struggling with it still. And if you understand the basics of plant life cycles, you can save yourselves money and disappointment. And it's one of the fundamentals that will give you quite a good grounding when you're choosing plants for your own home and garden. So if you're ordering seeds or planning changes to your garden at the moment, it's probably a good time to recap or have an introduction to the subject. So to start with, plants have life cycles, which basically means it's the time that it takes for them to germinate, grow, reproduce by way of flowering and setting seed, and then die. Some plants can achieve this process in weeks, and some take centuries or even millennia. And let's start with plants that live fast, die young, and leave a desiccated corpse. And these are known as ephemerals. In the UK, this category consists of short-lived spring plants that pop up and die back quickly, for example, trilliums, but it mainly consists of weeds like hairy bittercress, which can appear on a patch of soil, and it can be flinging its seed around quicker than you can say, mind that seed pod doesn't explode in your eye. You won't often, if ever, find something labelled as an ephemeral in this category in the garden centres. So it's less important to know about for trainee gardeners. But anyway, nonetheless, it's good to know about. Next up, we have the annuals, and you will find these for sale as seed now. They look lovely and tempting, and you probably won't be able to resist popping a few of the packets into your real or virtual shopping cart. Annuals complete their life cycle in 1 year, which is pretty straightforward. The problems can arise with annuals when you buy them unwittingly in the summer, thinking they're perennial and will come back next year. So it's fine to buy annuals as fully grown plants, as long as you're aware that that's what you're buying. So I would say buyer beware in this situation, because whereas you might spend £6, £8 on a perennial plant in a 2 to 3 litre pot, you probably wouldn't want to spend the same amount on a plant that's not going to come back next year. Yet some nurseries don't make it clear that there's a distinction between the annuals and perennials, and they'll charge the same price. So it's always good to ask if it's not made clear on the plant's label. And the other way that annuals can be a bit confusing is that the category is a little bit loose, and some plants get lumped in that don't really complete their life cycle within a year. Generally speaking, there are annuals such as lobelias, cosmos, marigolds, morning glory, and so on that will grow from seed in the spring. Then they'll flower throughout the summer, then die when it gets cold or when they've run out of steam and can't flower anymore, whichever happens first. And these are generally half hardy or tender annuals. Then you've got hardy annuals, and these can generally withstand lower temperatures, and you can sow them earlier in the year straight into the ground, or even in the autumn before, for some varieties in warmer places. And examples of hardy annuals include nasturtiums, cerinthe, calendula, cornflowers, and nigella. Hardy annuals are more likely to self-seed in your garden, so once you plant things like calendulas and nasturtiums, you'll probably find they come back year after year. And another type of plant that gets shoved into the annuals category is the tender perennial. And these are plants like pelargoniums, many of the salvias, bedding verbenas, marguerites, and et cetera, et cetera. Many people buy these as kind of small plants for bedding and then bin them at the end of the year. But if you do want to keep them for next year, you can cut back the main plant and overwinter it in a greenhouse. And you can also take the clippings from the parent plant and grow them on as cuttings in order to make new plants for the following year. And this could be the better option, as the parent plant sometimes gets a bit woody and a bit straggly. So next up, we've got biennials, and these are plants that put on green growth in the first year and then flower in their second year. If you grow them from seed, you'll be waiting 2 years to see flowers. And if you buy them in garden centres, you're generally buying second year plants, meaning that they'll flower, set seed, and then die that year. Classic biennials are foxgloves, honesty, evening primrose, sweet William, hollyhocks, angelicas. Many of the biennials will seed around your garden, but if you want a steady supply of them each year, you'll need to plant some in year 1 and some in year 2, as otherwise you'll only be getting a flower display every other year. So that's quite a good tip to remember. And then we're on to perennials, and these are the plants that live more than 2 years. So herbaceous perennials are plants that have soft green stems and leaves that die back to the ground in colder climates or in most UK winters. That said, the mild weather we've had over the past few years has meant that many of our herbaceous perennials have retained their crown of leaves and stems from one year into the next. Typical herbaceous perennials are things like Alchemilla mollis, Geum, Salvias, Agastache, Erigeron carvinskianus, and so on and so on. Some of the ornamental grasses are classed as perennials as well, but some of the grasses are annual. So again, this is something you should check when you buy them. Trees and shrubs are classed as woody perennials, meaning they retain some sort of above ground structure over the winter, and they survive from one year to the next. So apart from these main categories, you may come across subshrubs, which have both woody growth at the base and soft herbaceous growth at the tips. And examples of things like subshrubs are lavender, Perovskia, Artemisias, loosestrife, and thyme. And important things to remember about subshrubs is that they can be short-lived, they may not be terribly hardy, and even with the correct pruning at the correct time, they can get straggly and out of shape in a few years, to the point where you'll probably be sick of them and you'll turf them out your border. So that is a really brief overview of plant life cycles, and I'd like to point out that it's definitely not an exact science. For example, foxgloves often flower beyond year 2 and act like short-lived perennials. Cosmos are tender annuals, yet I've had them seed around in a garden, and I've got a Senecio cineraria, which is the silverleaf plant, that I bought as a bedding annual, and yet it's just coming up to its 4th winter in my garden. And all of that is not to mention bulbs, which can be a bit tricky. For example, most people assume that alliums are perennial, but if you take a listen to episode 7 where I speak to Jackie Curry, she explains that this isn't the case with all alliums, and you need to exercise caution when you're selecting varieties for a perennial display. So as I say, not an exact science, but more a guideline to help you avoid buying the wrong plant. So as I say, not an exact science, but more guidelines really to help you avoid buying the wrong plant for the wrong place. And that is the very first outing of the Get Into the Roots of segment. So please let me know what you think by emailing me at podcast@rootsandall.co.uk, and also let me know if you have any topics you'd like to see me cover. And also, if you know someone who might benefit from this information, don't forget you can copy and forward a link to the podcast if you're listening in iTunes, or similarly, you can just send a link to the podcast page of my website in order to share it. Also, please, if you haven't already, it's really important to rate the podcast so that others can find it. And also, please visit my Patreon page, which is patreon.com/rootsandall, where you can make a one-off donation or subscribe to support the podcast. And it was pointed out to me that Patreon amounts appear on the site in dollars. So just to be clear, you won't get charged in dollars, and you won't get charged any fees to convert your cash into dollars. Patreon does the conversion itself, and it actually passes the fee on to me. So thank you to Tim for highlighting that, and I hope that clears things up. And one last thing, don't forget to visit my website www.rootsandall.co.uk, where you can sign up for my weekly newsletter, which provides you with a regular content roundup plus inside info on things like upcoming guests. I also wrote a couple of articles this week on what to do with autumn leaves in your garden, and also my top 5 easy to grow vegetables. So do stop by and take a look at that. Thank you for listening, and I will catch you next Tuesday when I will be talking seeds with urban grower Isaiah Levy.